April 1945. The southern part of Okinawa was transformed into a living graveyard. Thousands of civilians had retreated into limestone cave systems, hoping the thick rock would shield them from the hell raining down above. For many, these caves became their final homes. The outside world was consumed by explosions, gunfire, and the deafening hum of American aircraft. Inside, silence ruled. A silence broken only by muffled coughing, the soft whimpering of children, and the slow, dragging breaths of those too weak to stand.
Sachiko Nakamura sat motionless in the shadows, her body curled protectively around her children. Her daughter Yuki, barely 8, rested against her chest, her eyes glassy with exhaustion and fear. Beside them lay Haru, the baby, limp and frighteningly silent. Sachiko hadn't eaten in days. Her breast milk had dried up long ago, and her own limbs felt detached, like sandbags tied to her torso. The air in the cave was heavy with moisture, rot, and the faint metallic scent of blood.
The people hiding in that cave had not spoken aloud in days. Fear had eaten away their voices. No one dared to leave, not just because of the threat of American bullets, but because Japanese soldiers had warned that any attempt to surrender would be treated as treason. Some who ventured out had not returned. Those who did came back with missing limbs or silent, blank stares that hinted at horrors beyond words. Inside the cave, time no longer existed. Only waiting remained.
Children clung to their mothers, their bodies skeletal, their bellies bloated from malnutrition. Some had stopped crying altogether. Yuki had begun speaking less and less, as if every word cost too much energy. Haru no longer stirred, even when Sachiko nudged him. Her heart ached, but her mind had gone numb. Grief and hunger dulled everything. When she closed her eyes, she dreamed of rice. Not of safety or peace, just a single bowl of white rice. Among the others in the cave, there were elderly men and women who hadn't stood upright in weeks. One old man had died 2 days ago, and his body still lay in the corner, wrapped in a blanket out of respect, though the smell had begun to spread. No one had the strength to bury him. No one dared leave. The cave had become a space of collective resignation, a place where life quietly ebbed away without protest. There was no light source apart from thin cracks in the rock ceiling. Dust danced in the shafts of sunlight, but they brought no warmth. People kept their backs to the wall, their eyes to the floor. Even when they drank rainwater collected in rusty cans, they did so silently, as if to avoid drawing death's attention. Outside, American leaflets sometimes dropped from the sky, promising food and safety, but no one believed them. They were said to be tricks, bait to lure the weak into capture or torture. The propaganda had done its job too well. The fear of American cruelty had taken root deep within their bones. Mothers whispered bedtime warnings about enemy soldiers with teeth like knives. Children had been taught that surrender meant worse than death. And now, faced with starvation and collapse, those same children huddled in caves, too afraid to accept the possibility of mercy. Sachiko had lost count of the days. Her sense of time faded like her body's sensation of cold or pain. She only knew that Haru hadn't moved since the night before. She hadn't tried to wake him yet. A small, broken part of her still hoped he was just asleep. She cradled Yuki, pressing her cracked lips to the girl's forehead, and waited. Waited for something, a sound, a miracle, or the end. Above them, the war thundered on. But in the damp silence of the cave, the louder war was internal. The struggle to survive another hour, to believe in a future that didn't end in darkness. The only victory left was keeping your child alive until tomorrow. And even that, here in the crying caves of Okinawa, felt impossible. By the spring of 1945, the Japanese Empire had turned Okinawa into its final defensive line before the mainland. The island, once known for its quiet villages and deep-rooted traditions, became a battleground where civilians were treated as expendable assets. The Imperial Army entrenched itself among the population, building tunnels beneath homes and schools, placing artillery near shrines and farms. But more devastating than the physical war was the psychological one. The Japanese government waged a brutal campaign of fear against its own people. Through radio broadcasts, leaflets, school curricula, and whispered orders from village leaders, civilians were told that Americans were not human. They were described as monsters, rapists, torturers, cannibals. Stories spread of children being boiled alive, women dismembered, and old men used for bayonet practice. These weren't isolated rumors. They were systemic lies, crafted and distributed by the state to ensure that no one would dare surrender, even in the face of starvation. The fear wasn't just of occupation, it was of annihilation. Propaganda was embedded in daily life. Children sang songs in school that glorified death and demonized the foreign enemy. Textbooks compared Americans to wild beasts and taught that true honor lay in dying for the emperor. Teachers, many of whom doubted these claims in private, repeated them with conviction in public. If they didn't, they risked their own lives. The entire society had been conditioned for years to believe that surrender was shameful and death was sacred. Village headmen, under orders from military officials, passed down chilling commands. Anyone caught waving a white flag would be executed on the spot. Families were told to kill themselves rather than be captured. In some areas, grenades were distributed for the express purpose of mass suicide. Mothers were instructed how to hold their children close when they pulled the pin, to ensure both would die together. These were not abstract threats, they were enforced policies. In the final weeks before the American landings, the level of indoctrination intensified. Radio messages urged families to die with dignity rather than live in dishonor. Government pamphlets glorified stories of entire villages committing suicide in unison. Soldiers praised civilians who took their lives rather than risk capture. This wasn't merely loyalty to country, it was the weaponization of hopelessness. The enemy had not yet arrived, but terror already ruled every cave, hut, and field. People began to see death as the only rational choice. Parents quietly planned when to end their children's lives. Some did it early, fearing what would happen if they waited. Others hesitated, clinging to the possibility of survival. But with food gone, bodies piling up, and the sky filled with explosions, the line between life and death blurred. The caves were filled not only with starving families, but with the tools and intentions to end those lives before Americans could reach them. And so, the caves were more than hiding places. They were tombs in waiting, where civilians rehearsed their final moments. Children were told not to cry too loudly, not because of enemy soldiers, but because it might disturb others trying to prepare for death. Songs of defiance were sometimes whispered, though often followed by silence, shame, or sobbing. Every sound of boots or gunfire outside stirred dread, not because it meant the Americans were near, but because it meant the moment to die might be at hand. The psychological grip of the Japanese state was total. Fear became a currency, traded between neighbors, passed down to children, internalized by all. Even if an American soldier had arrived with open arms and gifts of food, most civilians would not have believed it. They would have run. Or worse, they would have reached for the grenades they had been told were gifts of honor. The island had been prepared for sacrifice, not for survival. In this climate of orchestrated terror, the truth became irrelevant. People no longer asked questions or trusted their instincts.
They trusted only fear. It was safer, more predictable, and in a world shattered by war, fear was the only thing that made sense anymore. Private Jack Elliott had seen many strange and terrible things during his months in the Pacific, but nothing prepared him for what he witnessed in the hills of southern Okinawa. His unit was sweeping through a sector dotted with caves, most of them either empty or filled with terrified civilians too weak to flee. It was a quiet kind of chaos, no screaming, no running, just shadows shifting behind rocks and the smell of rot and wet stone. He moved cautiously, his rifle low, eyes scanning for danger. But what he saw that day didn't resemble an enemy. It resembled surrender in its purest, most fragile form. She appeared from the darkness like a ghost, barefoot and covered in dust. She was maybe 8, maybe younger, though war had made it hard to tell. Her hair was tangled, her dress torn, hanging like a sheet on a skeleton. Her eyes were enormous in her thin face, black and still. She did not speak. She simply looked at him, not with hatred or fear, but something closer to emptiness. Jack stopped moving. She didn't run. He reached slowly into his pack, pulled out a chocolate bar, and held it in the air. The Hershey's wrapper caught a sliver of light, and for the first time he saw her eyes shift, not in panic, but recognition. She stepped forward, just one step, then another. When she was close enough, she reached out with trembling fingers and took the chocolate. But she didn't eat it. Instead, she held the bar gently, like something sacred. She lifted it to her nose and inhaled, as if trying to remember what sweetness smelled like. Her lips quivered. And then, in broken Japanese, she whispered, "Can I give it to my brother?" Jack didn't understand all the words, but he understood enough. He nodded. She turned and disappeared back into the cave. Something pulled at Jack. Not military instinct, not orders, just a feeling. He followed. The inside of the cave was damp and cold. His boots splashed through shallow puddles as he ducked under low ceilings. The light grew dim, but he could make out her silhouette kneeling beside something. It took him a moment to realize it was another child, a boy, maybe 3 years old, lying still on a pile of blankets and ash. The girl was trying to feed him the chocolate. She gently touched the bar to his lips, whispering in his ear, trying to wake him. Jack froze. The boy wasn't breathing. His body was stiff, his face turned slightly away. The girl, unaware or unwilling to accept it, kept coaxing, 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 as if the taste of sugar could bring him back. Jack felt a pressure rise in his chest. He sank to his knees and covered his face. He had seen death before, but this was different. This was a child offering the last good thing in her world to someone who could no longer receive it. It was grief without ceremony, a funeral without recognition, and it broke something inside him. The girl looked up at him, confused by his silence. She didn't cry. She had forgotten how. She just kept holding the chocolate, unsure what to do now. Jack wiped his face with the sleeve of his uniform and gently reached out. She recoiled for a moment, but then handed him the chocolate bar, half melted now. Quietly, he wrapped it back up and placed it in her hand. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say. He simply placed a second bar next to her, stood up, and walked away. Outside the cave, the sun was high, the battle distant, but inside him, the war was louder than ever. He had come to fight monsters, but what he found was a girl, a corpse, and a chocolate bar that couldn't save anyone. As the front line shifted and organized combat gave way to occupation duties, American troops began encountering civilians in larger numbers. Entire villages emerged from underground tunnels and hillside caves, blinking in the sunlight, frightened and skeletal.
Many couldn't walk on their own. Children stared with hollow eyes, their limbs thin as broomsticks, their stomachs bloated from malnutrition. Some soldiers, hardened by years of battle, admitted later they were unprepared for the sheer scale of civilian suffering they found on Okinawa. Sergeant Bob Martinez, assigned to oversee humanitarian supply in the town of Hershey, had never managed a food line before, but after finding over 200 civilians living in a maze of tunnels under the bombed-out remains of the town, he realized order was the only thing that could prevent panic. He established a simple system. People would line up, receive food based on family size and visible need. Children received extra portions. The sick and elderly were moved to shaded areas and given softer, more digestible items. The first item handed out was usually canned meat, spam, corned beef, ham. For Okinawans who had been surviving on tree bark and boiled weeds, it was overwhelming. Some hesitated, unsure if it was real. Others opened the tins with trembling hands, inhaled the scent, and burst into tears. The richness of the food was too much for some to process at once. A few became sick from eating too fast, unaccustomed to anything but starvation. Coffee, too, became an unexpected bridge. American instant coffee was distributed in the evenings, often near makeshift fires built in destroyed courtyards. Civilians watched curiously as soldiers poured hot water over brown powder, stirred it, and sipped slowly. For many Okinawans, it was their first experience with coffee. The bitter taste was strange, but it was warm and social, and for a moment, it made people feel human again. Hanako Suzuki, a former school teacher, later recalled her first sip of American coffee. A young soldier smiled and gestured for her to sit. She expected cruelty, maybe a trick, but instead he just handed her a warm tin cup. The taste was sharp, alien, but the gesture was simple and kind. It was the first time in months she had sat beside someone without fear. The firelight, the quiet slurping of coffee, and the murmur of unfamiliar English made the world feel softer, if only for an evening. Then came the gum. For the children, chewing gum was a magical invention. At first, they tried to eat it, chewing once or twice before attempting to swallow. Soldiers laughed gently, pulled the gum from their own mouths, and demonstrated how to keep chewing without swallowing. It was a novelty, but it brought laughter. In a world still filled with rubble and loss, the act of blowing a bubble became a moment of joy. 10-year-old Jiro Miyagi remembered the day Corporal Danny Walsh showed him how to blow a bubble. The children gathered around like it was a street performance. Each attempt brought giggles, gasps, and eventually a burst of cheers when Jiro succeeded. That piece of gum didn't just taste sweet. It gave him a memory untouched by war, the feeling of being just a boy, not a victim. These small moments, a tin of meat, a sip of coffee, a stick of gum, carried far more meaning than their physical worth. They were signals, deliberate or not, that the enemy was not the monster he had been described to be. American abundance wasn't just in calories, but in spirit. What they shared wasn't just food, but the possibility of peace. For the civilians of Okinawa, these tastes became the first steps back toward hope. In the weeks that followed the end of major combat operations, something extraordinary began to unfold across Okinawa. As American supply chains stabilized and food distribution became more organized, the youngest victims of the war started to show signs of recovery. Children who had once been silent, glassy-eyed husks began to speak again, to smile, and to play. The transformation was so rapid in some cases that even experienced medics were stunned. Where there had been stillness and despair, life returned in fragile, flickering moments. Infants who had been considered too far gone to survive were the first miracles. With access to canned milk, baby formula, and high-protein recovery rations, their swollen bellies slowly flattened, their skeletal frames filled out, and their eyes became alert. Army nurses, many of whom had previously served in field hospitals, shifted their focus to refeeding protocols and nutrient monitoring. They learned quickly that malnourished children needed careful attention. Too much, too fast could kill them. So they fed them slowly, steadily, and with quiet encouragement. Lieutenant Helen Chang, a military nurse assigned to a civilian care unit, kept handwritten records of the children she treated. She wrote about hair regrowth in children who had been bald from vitamin deficiency, about the return of natural skin tones, and about the day one toddler finally took his first unassisted step after weeks of lying still. She described the sound of giggles echoing through makeshift clinics and the way little hands reached out for more than just food. They reached for comfort, connection, and reassurance. Food was saving their bodies, but kindness was reviving their spirits.
In many of the villages, American soldiers informally adopted small groups of children, visiting them daily to share rations or simply sit with them. Some built makeshift swings from ropes and tree limbs. Others played catch with ration tins or taught the children clumsy English words. The children, in turn, taught them songs, gestures, and how to say thank you in Okinawan dialects. These exchanges, though simple, became sacred. They marked the start of something deeper than just physical healing. The psychological change was just as visible as the physical one. Children who had previously cowered at the sight of a uniform now ran toward soldiers, calling out their names or pulling at their sleeves for attention. They brought flowers, pebbles, or little woven trinkets as gifts. One girl gave her American friend a small doll made from rice straw and cloth torn from a dead woman's kimono. It was all she had. The soldiers, many of whom had not seen their own children in years, were often moved to tears by these offerings. Parents, too, watched the changes with disbelief and gratitude. Mothers who had prepared to bury their sons now combed their hair and fed them warm meals. Fathers who had survived in silence began to smile again, seeing their children come back from the edge of death. In some cases, these transformations reawakened parental bonds that had been buried under weeks of trauma. Feeding a child, dressing a wound, hearing a laugh, these became the rituals of rebirth. The U.S. military didn't just provide emergency aid. It built a system of long-term recovery. Rations were supplemented with vitamins, fresh fruits flown in from bases abroad, and educational materials for caregivers. Clinics were established in school buildings, temples, and even bombed-out police stations. These spaces became not just centers of healing, but islands of order in a sea of destruction. They brought structure, predictability, and hope. By late summer, the children of Okinawa looked different. Their clothes were still torn, and their homes still rubble, but their faces were no longer masks of starvation. They were flushed with color, animated by energy, and often found in motion, running, dancing, mimicking the Americans who had saved them. A transformation was taking place not just in their bodies, but in their understanding of the world. They had survived the war. Now they were learning to live again. By August 1945, the war in Okinawa was officially over, but the emotional and psychological impact continued to unfold. Over 200,000 civilians, many of whom had been hiding in caves just weeks earlier, were now receiving daily food rations from the very soldiers they had once been taught to fear. The trauma did not vanish overnight, but small gestures, a shared meal, a soft blanket, a warm drink, began to shape new perceptions. What had once seemed unthinkable became reality. American soldiers, labeled as monsters, were now protectors. The island was slowly learning to breathe again. For many civilians, especially mothers, the relief was layered with guilt. They remembered the things they had believed, the weapons they had hidden, the suicide they had prepared for. Yet, when mercy arrived in the form of canned peaches and warm hands, it forced a reckoning. Sachiko Nakamura, like many others, often watched her daughter eat in silence, grateful beyond words, but haunted by what could have been.
Her son had not survived, but her daughter had, and somehow that felt like both a victory and a wound.
Children who had been brought back from the brink of death carried the memory of this mercy deep within them. They did not remember dates or battles, but they remembered chocolate, the warmth of coffee fires, and the laughter around gum bubbles. These sensory moments became bookmarks in their young minds, symbols of survival, connection, and the possibility of kindness from unexpected places. Over the years, those memories would shape who they became. Some would grow up to be translators, diplomats, and bridge builders between two former enemies. Even elderly survivors, hardened by decades of imperial loyalty, found their convictions shifting. Some spoke of their astonishment at how organized, generous, and respectful the American distribution systems were. Others admitted they had seen more compassion in one American soldier than in years under Japanese military rule. These realizations didn't erase the pain of loss, but they reframed the idea of what victory and defeat meant. For the first time, survival didn't feel like shame. It felt like a beginning. The American occupation forces introduced more than food. They brought medical systems, administrative structures, and a model of governance that, though foreign, began to make sense. Local leaders were recruited to help organize aid fairly. Women who had once been silent in public found themselves in classrooms again, learning new skills and even teaching American volunteers about Okinawan traditions. The exchange was not one-sided. It was a slow rebuilding, a mosaic of resilience and shared effort. Among the soldiers, stories of the Okinawan civilians became part of their own war narratives. Letters home included descriptions of starving children turned playful, of mothers who bowed deeply in gratitude, of small hands tugging at uniforms for more crackers. These were the moments they carried with them, not the firefights or medals, but the times when humanity pushed through the horror. Some returned home and never spoke of the battles, but they did speak of the girl who shared her chocolate with a dead brother. The transformation was not only personal but political. The kindness extended during those months laid a foundation for the post-war alliance between Japan and the United States. Leaders who emerged from the ashes of war found public support not just because of political ideology, but because of lived experience. Civilians who remembered what it felt like when an enemy chose compassion over vengeance. Diplomacy was written, in part, in the language of rations, tents, and healing. Years later, many survivors would recount the smallest details with perfect clarity. The texture of white bread, the way canned pineapple juice stung cracked lips, the warm weight of a blanket handed out by a foreigner. These details did not fade. They endured longer than gunfire, longer than rubble. They became proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, there had been light. In the end, the war did not end in total annihilation for Okinawa. It ended in an unexpected act of grace. The taste of chocolate, once feared as poison, became a symbol of peace. And for those who lived through it, that taste remained, bitter, sweet, unforgettable.